On February 9, 2021, the winter air hung over Chickasha, Oklahoma, with a kind of stillness that made every sound stand out. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours earlier, leaving the streets bathed in a pale orange haze from the street lamps. This was a community that prided itself on familiarity, and the rhythm of daily life was predictable. People tended to their chores, cooked dinner, and settled in for the night, with the comfort of knowing that nothing much ever happened here. On Jones Street, the quiet was almost absolute. Occasionally cars passed by, with tires whispering over the asphalt. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then silence returned. The Pye household, a modest home with a front porch light glowing warmly, looked like a picture of domestic peace. Across the street, Andrea Blankenship's home sat close by. From the outside, there was no sign that within the next hour, both houses would become crime scenes that would shake Oklahoma to its core. Just around the corner, a man was walking free who should have still been in a prison cell. His name was Lawrence Paul Anderson, 44 years old, a man with a criminal history that included drug dealing and violent offenses. He had been sentenced to decades in prison, but an administrative decision had shortened that sentence dramatically. 3 weeks earlier, he had walked out of prison, not because his time was done, but because of a procedural failure. At the time, no one in Chickasha knew this. They didn't know the system had miscalculated, or that it had placed a dangerous man right back into their streets. Anderson was no stranger to the town. People who knew him from years past recalled a man with unpredictable moods and erratic behavior, but few could have imagined what he was about to do. That night, something in him, whether planned or sudden, pushed him toward violence. Investigators would later struggle to pinpoint the exact trigger, but it began with his focus settling on Andrea's house across the street. Andrea Lynn Blankenship was at home that evening. Her house was modest, with a chain-link fence running around the small front yard and curtains drawn over the windows. The faint glow of a television flickered inside. She had no reason to believe danger was near. She had 2 German Shepherd dogs at the time. Meanwhile, Anderson's movements before reaching her home remained partly unknown. Surveillance footage from around town showed him walking alone earlier in the day, dressed in dark clothing, his hands deep in his pockets. There was no sign of panic or fear. Neighbors who later looked back recalled seeing him walking with an unsettling calm. Shortly before 7 p.m., he crossed the street toward Andrea's home. The street was empty, the cold air biting at his face. The sound of his boots on the pavement was muffled by the distance from any onlookers. He approached the side of the house, not the front door, the path suggesting this wasn't a casual visit, but something more deliberate. Anderson stepped closer to Andrea's home, the dark figure barely noticeable in the quiet landscape. The world around him remained undisturbed, but inside of him, something had shifted. A decision had been made. Whatever thoughts ran through his mind in those final moments before violence began, they would never be fully known. All that would be left was the trail he was about to leave behind, one that would haunt every person connected to it. Inside her home on Jones Street, Andrea Lynn Blankenship was spending what should have been an uneventful Tuesday night. The scent of her dinner lingered faintly in the air. Andrea had lived in Chickasha for years. Friends described her as private but kind, someone who enjoyed the solitude of her home. Shortly after, a faint creak came from the backyard gate. Seconds later, there was a harder noise. The back door rattled violently. Before she could process what was happening, the door splintered under the force of a shoulder slam. The frame cracked, the lock gave way, and Lawrence Paul Anderson stepped inside. There is no exact story behind how Anderson overpowered her dogs and successfully got to her, but it was most likely that Andrea's instinct was to fight. She wasn't passive. She must have reached for something nearby, maybe a heavy object, maybe a kitchen knife. But Anderson was already moving toward her. The distance between them closed in seconds. The first strike came fast, aimed high, slicing into her upper arm as she tried to shield herself. She cried out, but the walls of her home kept it contained. No neighbor heard it in time. Each movement after that was frenzied. The knife rose and fell, stabbing into her chest, her arms, and into different parts of her body. She stumbled backward into the kitchen, trying to create space, but Anderson followed relentlessly. The blade struck again and again, the sound of metal hitting bone mixing with her strained breaths. Later, the medical examiner would count nearly 40 stab wounds, each one telling the story of an attack that didn't pause, didn't slow, didn't allow for escape. She fell to the floor near the counter. Her breathing was ragged, blood pooling beneath her. Still, there were signs she had tried to fight until the end. Cuts along her hands where she had grabbed at the knife blade, bruises on her forearms where she had tried to block the strikes. Then, the attack changed. Anderson crouched over her, his focus no longer on ending her life. That part was nearly done. He was focused on something else entirely. With the precision of someone driven by a disturbing purpose, he reached into the wounds he had made. He removed her heart. This was not a frantic act of rage. It was controlled and deliberate. He placed it in a plastic bag, tucking it carefully as though it were something to be kept safe. Around Andrea's body, investigators would later find a chaotic scene. Multiple bloody knives, a broken box cutter, scattered drill bits and screws, a sewing machine pushed partially off a table, and even a blood-stained tree branch. It was as if anything within reach had been considered as a weapon or tool during the assault. The sheer range of items spoke to the violence in the room, an unrestrained, all-consuming attack. Anderson stepped over the blood and walked toward the door, heart in hand, leaving Andrea's body on the kitchen floor. The television still played in the background, flickering light over the scene. The back door hung from one hinge, cold air rushing inside. For Andrea, the world had ended in her own home, the one place she should have been safe. There was no chance to call for help, no time to reach for her phone. The attack had been too sudden, too brutal. And within minutes of it ending, her killer was crossing the street to his next destination. Across the road, Leon and Delcy Pye's porch light glowed faintly. They were unaware that their nephew, carrying a human heart in a bag, was about to walk inside. With blood on his hands and a plastic bag gripped tightly in his fist, Lawrence Paul Anderson stepped out of Andrea Blankenship's house and into the cold Chickasha night. The porch light cast a weak glow onto the front steps, but he moved without hesitation, as though guided by something inside him, something resolved. The street outside was silent, empty. No headlights. No voices. No witnesses. Across the road, the house of Leon and Delcy Pye stood quiet. Their home had been a place of family, of laughter, and of warmth, but that night it would become something else entirely. Anderson walked slowly, the bag swinging slightly at his side. Inside it was Andrea Blankenship's heart, still warm, still wet, taken with surgical intention from the woman he had murdered only minutes earlier. This was not a trophy, it was not symbolic, and to Anderson, it had purpose. He would later tell investigators he intended to feed the heart to his family. He believed it would release the demons. The explanation, as chilling as it was nonsensical, offered a window into the mind of someone operating beyond the edges of reality. Whether delusion or calculated justification, his next actions made one thing clear. He had entered a state where empathy, logic, and humanity no longer applied. He approached the Pye home, mounted the front steps, and opened the door. He didn't knock. He didn't hesitate. Inside the home, Leon Pye, 67, sat in his favorite chair in the living room. He was a man known for his generosity, always offering advice and support to those who needed it. He had taken Anderson in before, fed him, welcomed him, even after others in the family had warned against it. Delcy Pye, 66, was nearby, possibly in the hallway or just beyond the kitchen. Their 4-year-old granddaughter, Chaos Yates, was visiting at the time. Her toys were scattered across the carpet. A juice cup sat forgotten on the coffee table. The television murmured in the background. Some talk show or late-night drama, unimportant, irrelevant to what was now entering their world. Anderson greeted them, perhaps calmly. He had not yet drawn his knife. He did not announce what he had done. Instead, he walked into the kitchen and placed the bag on the counter. Then he opened a cabinet and removed a pot. He filled it with water. He set it on the stove. The burner clicked, the gas hissed. A blue flame ignited beneath the metal. From the fridge or a nearby shelf, he retrieved some potatoes. He peeled and sliced them, dropped them into the boiling water. Then he reached into the bag and pulled out the heart. He placed it into the pot. The smell began to rise. Not one associated with food, but something unfamiliar as it filled the room and slowly drifted toward the hallway. Delcy entered the kitchen. What she saw must have frozen her in place. Her nephew, hands bloody, calmly cooking, standing at the stove as if preparing dinner. The pot bubbling. A shape in the water that did not belong. She asked what he was doing. He told her. The words were blunt and emotionless. He spoke of demons. He said the heart needed to be consumed to purge them. Delcy didn't scream. Not yet. She tried to process what she was hearing. Tried to convince herself that this was some kind of twisted joke. That he hadn't just confessed to murder, to desecration, to some act beyond imagination. But her instincts knew better. Anderson's mood shifted. Whether her fear set him off, or whether this had always been part of his plan, no one can say. What's certain is that the moment passed quickly, from strange to threatening in an instant. At some point, Anderson grew agitated. Leon, hearing the rising tension, stepped into the kitchen. He saw the knife, saw the pot, and he may have known, then and there, that they were in danger, real, immediate danger. Anderson's eyes locked onto his uncle's. There was no turning back. But the attack didn't begin just yet. Not here. In those moments, there was a terrible pause, a space of time where everyone in the house stood still, uncertain of what was about to happen. Anderson's breathing grew heavier. His hands clenched the edge of the counter. Behind him, the stove hissed steadily. For those in the house, it may have felt like standing in the presence of something unrecognizable, a loved one transformed, a man now driven by something dark and unreachable. And then, something in him snapped. The time for words was over. The silence in that kitchen shattered. Anderson reached for his knife. What followed would unfold with speed and savagery. A man, once imprisoned, now freely moving through the lives of his family with a weapon in his hand and delusion in his mind. And no one outside knew. The street remained quiet, the neighbors unaware. But the first victim was already gone, and the next were only steps away. The kitchen's fluorescent light hummed overhead, illuminating the sheen of sweat on his face, the dried streaks of blood on his clothes. Leon stepped forward, his voice firm but not yet raised. He told Anderson to stop whatever he was doing, to turn off the stove, to sit down and explain himself. But the suggestion fell flat. Anderson didn't move toward the table. Instead, he adjusted his grip on the counter, as though bracing for something. Delcy took a slow step back toward the hallway. She wasn't retreating entirely, but she was creating space, her mind calculating the distance between herself and the phone in the living room. In her head, she weighed the risk of leaving Leon alone with him. But before she could decide, Anderson shifted. He turned slightly, speaking now in fragmented sentences, repeating words about demons, about cleansing, about needing them to eat whatever horror was boiling in the pot on the stove. His eyes were fixed, unblinking. Chaos had stood up now, creeping toward the kitchen doorway, the soft padding of her socks against the linoleum almost inaudible. She wanted to be closer to her grandmother, sensing the unease in the room. Delcy caught sight of her and subtly motioned for her to stay back, her hand low and her eyes wide with warning. Anderson finally lifted the knife. He didn't shout. But the message was clear. This was no longer a discussion. Leon's posture changed instantly. He straightened, readying himself. His voice, when he spoke again, was sharper, more commanding. He told Anderson to put the knife down. He called him by name, as though using the familiar would cut through whatever haze had settled over him. But there was no shift in his expression. Anderson simply stepped closer to Leon, closing the gap between them. His breathing deepened, his grip on the knife tightened. Leon stepped forward, not aggressively, but firmly, planting himself between Anderson and Delcy's path. The unspoken message was clear: if something happened, it should happen to him first. In that moment, the home teetered on a razor's edge. The knife moved first. A swift, deliberate motion, no warning, no build-up, just a flash of steel crossing the space between nephew and uncle. The sound was dull and heavy, the impact muffled by flesh and bone. Leon Pye gasped, his breath catching in his chest as the blade drove into him. The living room and kitchen, moments ago charged with silent tension, now erupted into chaos. Delcy screamed. Not a word, just a sharp, tearing sound that split the air. The cry jolted Chaos, who stumbled backward into the hallway, her small voice lost in the sudden violence. Anderson didn't pause. He struck again, the knife rising and falling with rhythmic precision. Leon tried to fend him off, hands raised, but the force was relentless. The blade found its mark again and again. Chest, stomach, ribs. Blood spilled quickly, soaking into his shirt, spreading across the kitchen floor. Leon staggered back toward the counter, his hand groping for anything that could serve as a weapon, but Anderson was faster. He stepped in close, closing off every angle, driving the blade deeper. The sound of the strikes mixed with the bubbling pot on the stove felt like a grotesque symphony of violence and horror mixed together. Delcy rushed forward, grabbing at Anderson's arm, trying to pull him away. For a brief second, she succeeded. The knife wavered, but Anderson turned on her, shoving her with enough force to send her sprawling against the wall. Her ribs cracked under the impact. Pain shot through her body, but she pushed herself up, unwilling to leave Leon alone. Leon's knees buckled. He sank to the floor, one hand clutching his side, the other pressed to the ground to steady himself. Blood pooled beneath him, spreading outward, dark and thick. His breaths were shallow now, ragged gasps that carried the sound of a man struggling against the inevitable. Anderson stood over him. For a moment, there was stillness, a pause that almost seemed reflective. But it was not mercy. He adjusted his grip on the knife and leaned down, delivering one final, deliberate thrust. The blade sank in and stayed there for a beat before being pulled free. Leon collapsed fully, his head hitting the linoleum with a soft, final thud. His eyes remained open, fixed on nothing. His chest no longer rose. The life that had once filled the room with laughter, with warmth, was gone. Delcy's voice cracked as she called his name. The sound was raw and desperate. But there was no answer. She scrambled toward him, slipping in the blood, her hands shaking as she tried to reach for his face, his chest, anything that might bring him back. Anderson stepped away, breathing heavily but not winded. The murder had been swift, efficient. There was no remorse on his face, no sign of hesitation. His attention shifted almost immediately, scanning the room, assessing the next step. Delcy's grief morphed into something sharper: survival. She pulled herself upright, her injuries screaming in protest. Her vision blurred, one eye clouded from damage that would never fully heal. She needed to get Chaos out. She needed to end this before there were more bodies on the floor. But Anderson wasn't finished. His breathing steadied. His grip on the knife tightened once more. He turned his gaze toward Delcy, his shoes leaving streaks of red across the linoleum. Leon lay between them, a silent, still barrier that did nothing to slow the advance. For Delcy, every second counted now. She glanced toward the hallway, where Chaos stood frozen. If she could get to her, just get her out the front door, there might still be a chance. But she didn't make it to the hallway. Anderson closed the gap in 2 steps, raising the knife again. The attack on her would come next, as relentless and devastating as the one that had just ended Leon's life. And with Leon gone, there was nothing left to stop him. Delcy barely had time to react before Anderson was on her. The distance between them vanished in an instant. The knife rose, catching the harsh kitchen light, and then came down with violent force. The first blow caught her high on the shoulder, the blade slicing deep enough to tear through muscle. Pain exploded across her body, sharp and electric. She cried out, stumbling backward into the hallway wall. Anderson followed, relentless. The next strike came lower, catching her side. She tried to twist away, but the narrow hallway left no room to maneuver. Her back hit the wall again, the drywall crunching under the impact. Each blow drove her further into the corner, trapping her like prey against stone. She raised her arms to shield her face, but Anderson shifted the angle, targeting her head and regions around her neck. One thrust came dangerously close to her right eye, grazing the skin just below it. The pain was blinding and instantaneous. A scream tore from her throat, high and raw. The world went white for a split second, then collapsed into a crushing darkness on one side. She could feel the blood running hot down her cheek, pooling at her jaw before dripping to the floor. Anderson did not stop. The knife moved again, slicing across her arm as she tried to push him back. Her ribs absorbed another heavy blow, not from the knife this time, but from the sheer force of his body slamming into hers. Something inside her cracked. The sharp ache told her it was the sound of broken ribs. Breathing became harder, each inhale shallow and painful. Still, she fought. Her hands clawed at his arm, at the wrist holding the knife, desperate to knock it free. Her nails dug into his skin, leaving deep red lines, but Anderson's grip didn't falter. He shoved her again, harder this time, sending her to the floor. Somewhere behind him, she could hear Chaos whimpering, the tiny sound threading through the chaos like a plea. Chaos had been standing in the hallway through much of the attack on her grandmother, frozen in place, her small hands clutching the edge of the doorframe. She was too young to fully understand the chaos unfolding before her, but old enough to recognize danger. Her wide eyes followed every movement, her chest rising and falling quickly, her breaths shallow with fear. Chaos stepped back, her heel catching on the baseboard. Anderson closed the distance in 2 strides. The knife gleamed briefly in the dim light as he raised it. Chaos tried to back further away, but there was nowhere to go. The hallway ended behind her. Her body pressed into the wall as his shadow fell over her. What happened next would be seared into the evidence files of the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. By chance, at some point before attacking the child, Anderson had made a phone call to a man in Arkansas. He had not hung up. The open line captured the sounds inside the Pye home, not visuals, not images, just the audio of what unfolded. The recording begins with muffled movement, the faint sound of breathing, and then Chaos's voice, soft, shaking. She says something indistinct, perhaps calling for her grandmother again. Then comes the sound that investigators would later describe simply as screaming. It was high-pitched, piercing, carrying both fear and pain in a way that needed no translation. The noises that follow are abrupt, final. And then, silence. Delcy, in the living room, had heard it all. She was injured, her vision blurred, her breathing ragged, but the moment she realized what was happening, she tried to move toward the hallway. Her legs faltered under her, every step sending pain through her ribs and back, but the thought of her granddaughter alone in that narrow space drove her forward. She didn't make it in time. Chaos was slumped against the wall, her small body motionless. Anderson stood just a few feet away, watching. He showed no sign of hesitation, no flicker of emotion. His expression was the same as it had been in the kitchen, the same as it had been with Leon. It was flat, fixed, and detached. It was as though the humanity in the room did not touch him. The phone call in Arkansas would remain connected for several more minutes. The man on the other end, realizing something was horribly wrong, would later turn the recording over to investigators. It became one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence in the case. When law enforcement first reviewed the audio, even seasoned investigators had to pause the playback. The rawness of the sounds, the unmistakable terror in the child's voice, and the abrupt silence that followed left no doubt about the brutality of what had occurred. It was evidence not only of the murder itself, but of the manner in which it had been carried out. The Pye home had become a place of silence, heavy, unrelenting, and absolute silence. For investigators later, this moment in the timeline, the murder of a 4-year-old child, would stand as the most incomprehensible act of the night. The brutality toward the adults was devastating enough, but the deliberate choice to turn that same violence on a child removed any possibility of this being seen as random or frenzied. It was calculated, intentional, and final. Delcy would survive to tell what happened in those moments, though the images and sounds would remain with her for the rest of her life. The first call for help came from a neighbor. It was shortly after nightfall when the 911 dispatch center received the report. Frantic, fragmented words about screams, about blood, about something terrible happening inside the Pye home. The voice on the other end of the line trembled, struggling to describe exactly what they had heard, but the urgency was unmistakable. Patrol units were dispatched immediately. Meanwhile, Anderson moved between rooms with a strange calm. He returned to the kitchen more than once, glancing at the pot on the stove, checking the front window, listening. It was unclear whether he expected someone or if he was simply waiting for the right moment to leave. There was no sign of panic, no rush to escape. The only movement that seemed deliberate was the occasional adjustment of the knife in his hand. The sound of sirens began faint in the distance. Delcy heard them first, a thin wail cutting through the still air. It grew louder, closer, until it seemed to vibrate through the floor. Her chest tightened with both hope and fear. Help was coming, but would they arrive in time? Outside, the first responding officers pulled up to the curb. Their vehicle lights painted the front of the house in alternating flashes of red and blue. Neighbors had gathered at a distance, their silhouettes visible under the street lamps, whispering to one another, eyes fixed on the Pye home. The officers approached with caution, weapons drawn. They had been told there were multiple victims inside, possibly a suspect still present. The front door was closed, but the porch light was on, casting a yellow glow across the wooden steps. One officer reached for the doorknob, finding it unlocked. The door swung inward slowly. The smell hit them first. Something odd was definitely cooking inside of that house. The floor just inside was streaked with red, leading toward the living room. The officer in front called out, "Police! Let me see your hands!" But there was no immediate reply. They moved in further, stepping carefully to avoid disturbing evidence. In the living room, they found Delcy collapsed against the couch, her clothes soaked in blood, her head tilted back as she tried to focus on the figures in uniform. Her voice was weak but urgent. "He's here, my nephew, he's here." From the kitchen, Anderson appeared in the doorway, the knife still in his hand, his expression unchanged from when the attacks began. The officers repeated their commands, with their voices firm and weapons leveled. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he lowered the knife to the counter. One officer moved in, ordering him to get on the ground. Anderson complied without resistance, lowering himself to his knees, then lying flat on his stomach. His hands were pulled behind his back with cuffs locking into place. The moment the metal clicked shut, the tension in the room shifted, from active threat to controlled chaos. As Anderson was led toward the front door, one officer stayed with Delcy, calling in for emergency medical support. She kept trying to speak, her words faltering as she slipped in and out of lucidity. Her hand gestured toward the hallway, toward where Leon and Chaos lay. The officer's face tightened, but he nodded, assuring her that help was on the way. Additional units arrived, filling the small home with the sound of boots on the floor and the static of police radios. Paramedics pushed past the doorway, their gear clattering softly as they moved to Delcy first. They worked quickly, applying pressure to her wounds, checking her breathing, preparing her for immediate transport. In the hallway, Leon's body lay partially in the kitchen, his eyes open but unseeing, the surrounding floor slick with blood. Beyond him, in the narrow corridor, the small form of Chaos was against the wall. The sight was enough to silence even the most seasoned responders. The violence here had been total and deliberate. The officers moved methodically, clearing each room to confirm no other threats remained. The paramedics moved quickly with Delcy, lifting her onto a stretcher, securing her for the ride to the hospital. Neighbors watched from their porches as the ambulance pulled away, followed by a second vehicle carrying the bodies of Leon and Chaos. The scene was sealed off with yellow tape, the front yard lit by the harsh beams of portable floodlights. Reporters had already begun to gather at the edge of the block, their camera crews setting up in the shadows. Meanwhile, Anderson remained expressionless as he was transported to the county jail. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, OSBI, was called in almost immediately, their agents arriving before dawn to take over the case. The Pye home, along with Andrea Blankenship's house across the street, became the center of two active crime scenes, each connected by one man and one chain of events. Inside the Pye home, OSBI crime scene specialists began the meticulous process of documentation. Every surface was photographed, every drop of blood measured and marked. The narrow hallway where Chaos had been killed was treated like a contained narrative, each angle, each smudge on the wall telling a part of the story. Agents traced the blood spatter back to the points of impact, reconstructing the movements of both attacker and victims. In the kitchen, the pot on the stove was removed and sealed as evidence. A trail of blood led from the Pye home's front door across the street to Blankenship's residence. The path was uneven, broken in places by the attacker's movements, but it was enough to guide agents to the second crime scene without delay. Back at the agency's field office, analysts began processing the audio recording recovered from the man in Arkansas. It had been preserved exactly as it was received, a call made by Anderson, left open during the murder of Chaos. The weight of the evidence was already overwhelming. But OSBI agents wanted to ensure that no aspect of the case could be challenged in court. In the interrogation room at the county jail, Anderson sat across from two agents. He had been read his rights and had agreed to speak. The conversation began in a low, almost casual tone. Anderson admitted immediately to killing all three victims. The agents pressed him on the details of the night. Anderson described breaking into Andrea's home, attacking her without warning, and removing the heart. When asked why he attacked Leon, Delcy, and Chaos afterward, his answers grew less coherent, always shifting between mentions of voices, a sense of being led to do it, and sudden silence. OSBI agents compared Anderson's account with the physical evidence. The timeline matched in broad strokes, but many of the finer details were either omitted or altered in his version. His lack of emotional reaction was notable. Even when shown photographs of the victims, he remained impassive. The forensic team also confirmed that Anderson had been released from prison just 3 weeks before the murders. His release was the result of a commutation signed by Governor Kevin Stitt, a decision that would soon face intense public and political scrutiny. Anderson had been serving a 20-year sentence for drug-related offenses and probation violations. Under normal circumstances, he would not have been eligible for release so soon, but an error in processing allowed the commutation to proceed despite his ineligibility. For the OSBI, the priority remained securing a conviction that could not be overturned. By the time their work at both crime scenes was complete, they had compiled hundreds of photographs, hours of audio, dozens of witness statements, and forensic reports that left little to dispute. By the time the OSBI turned over its complete report to the district attorney's office, the path forward was clear. The physical evidence, the audio recording, the autopsy findings, and Anderson's own words formed an unshakable case. The only question that remained was whether prosecutors would seek the death penalty, a decision that would ultimately rest not just on legal strategy, but on the wishes of the victims' families. By the time Lawrence Anderson entered the Grady County Courthouse for his sentencing, the case had already drawn statewide attention. Reporters lined the courthouse steps, their cameras trained on the entrance, waiting for the man at the center of one of Oklahoma's most horrifying murder cases. He was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit, wrists shackled, a chain around his waist. His expression was the same as it had been the night of the murders, blank, detached, offering no visible acknowledgment of the moment. District Attorney Jason Hicks stood at the prosecution's table, his case files stacked neatly before him. Beside him, the lead OSBI agent sat ready to provide any detail if called upon. At the defense table, Anderson's court appointed an attorney to speak to him occasionally, but there was little response. Anderson's gaze remained fixed on a point just above the judge's bench. Before the formal proceedings began, Hicks addressed the court on the record. He explained that, after consultation with the victims' families, the state had chosen to withdraw its pursuit of the death penalty. The reason, he said, was simple. The families did not want a trial. They did not want to sit through weeks of testimony, photographs, and audio recordings detailing every aspect of the murders. They wanted closure without reliving the events in excruciating detail. This is a decision, Hicks told the judge, that honors the wishes of those most affected. The deal on the table was clear. Anderson would plead guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of assault and battery with a deadly weapon, and 1 count of maiming. In exchange, he would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a punishment that would ensure he would never walk free again. Judge Corey Kirkland addressed Anderson directly, asking if he understood the terms of the agreement. Anderson responded in a low voice, saying he did. There was no apology, no elaboration, no visible emotion. The judge then moved to hear the victim impact statements, the voices of those who had lost the most. First to speak was Delcy Pye, now 66 years old, her injuries still visible in the way she moved. She walked slowly to the podium, steadying herself with one hand. Her voice trembled at first but grew stronger as she spoke. "I can't sleep at night without having nightmares of that night," she said. "To think a family member of mine could do this heinous crime breaks my heart. Family means everything to me. As my nephew, I don't love you but I don't hate you. I can't judge you but God will." The room remained still, all eyes following her as she sat beside her relatives. Next came Quindessa Flowers, a granddaughter of Leon Pye. Her grief had hardened into rage, and her voice carried it with full force. "I hate you," she said, her gaze locked on Anderson. "I hate you for everything you've done. I hope you rot." Her voice broke only at the last word, but she did not look away until she stepped down. The mother of the youngest victim, Tasha Yates, spoke next. She described Chaos as a light in a dark world, a child who brought joy into every room she entered. "You extinguished that light," she told Anderson. "On Judgment Day, I pray your heart is full of fear." Her hands shook as she gripped the podium, but her voice never wavered. Then came John Hayden Blankenship, son of Andrea Blankenship. He looked directly at Anderson as he spoke. "You are a monster, pure evil, and a coward," he said plainly. "You took my mother from me, and for what? There's no reason. There's nothing that can justify what you did." His words were short, but their weight was undeniable. As each family member spoke, Anderson sat still, his head slightly lowered but his eyes open. There was no visible reaction, no sign that the words, the grief, or the anger reached him. After the statements concluded, Judge Kirkland returned to the formal sentencing. The defendant will spend the remainder of his natural life in the custody of the Oklahoma Department of Corrections. The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom. It was final. Anderson's fate was sealed. As deputies moved to escort him out, some family members called out to him one last time. The words ranged from curses to prayers. He did not turn his head. He walked between the deputies, shackles clinking softly, and disappeared through the side door. The courthouse slowly emptied, the echo of the day's testimony fading into the quiet of the evening. But for those who had spoken, and for those who had listened, the words would not fade so easily. The memory of that night, the faces of the victims, and the sound of the judge's gavel would remain, a reminder that justice, when it comes, is never without its own kind of weight. And that is how Anderson has carried his karma with him, inside those prison walls, until the end of his time will be on earth. I want to thank you all for being here. I truly appreciate your support to this channel. I will be seeing you soon on our next episode. Until then, stay well and stay safe.